All right, everybody. Thank you for joining. Welcome to another important webinar here from the FibTech. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. My name is Mike Papali. I am the Manager of Community Relations here at the FibTech. And, when we do these webinars, our goal is to share stories, share different organizations, and really try to educate as many people as possible on sudden cardiac arrest and the use of automated external defibrillators. So I'm really excited for a special guest that we have today. I had the opportunity to visit him and his organization in June, and was truly inspired by the amazing work they do, and making sure that organizations are equipped with AEDs, but not only that, also making sure that they're always ready to help save a life. So today I have Martin Fagan from the Community Heartbeat Trust. And the Community Heartbeat Trust has placed over about 8,500 automated external defibrillators, most of them throughout the UK. And again, not only are they placing them, but they are making sure that they are always set up and prepared and ready to help save a life. So, Martin, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
No, you're very welcome, Mike, and great pleasure to join you. I'm guessing it's a fairly international audience, so you'll forgive me if most of the information I relate is to do with the UK, but I'm sure it's easily to extrapolate it elsewhere. If there are any questions later on, then please do ask them in the forum at the end. And what I'll do is I'll just forward through a little presentation that we put together just to show you what we do and how we do it. And in that respect, I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully you should be able to see the presentation okay. Lovely. So let me just sort of start by introducing ourselves. So the Community Heartbeat Trust is a UK charity, and we existed in this form since about 2009. So we're about sort of 14, getting on for 15 years old. And we originated because we actually we're trying to do things in various groups around the UK, and in the late 2008, early 2009, various ambulance services in the UK said, "Look, there's another group down the road doing something which seems to be very similar to you. Why don't you all get together?" And that seemed a good idea. So we got everybody together in a hotel in May 2009, merged 6 of those organisations together to make one organisation called the Community Heartbeat Trust, and instantly we were national. So that's really the background. Our objective is very simple: it's to put defibs out there, but done in a very governance-led, resilient, and sustainable way. So for the purpose of this presentation, there's 2 sort of short terms we're going to use quite a bit: SCA, sudden cardiac arrest, and OHSCA, out of hospital sudden cardiac arrest. Really, just to differentiate those 2. So let me ask you a little question, something you can think about very quickly. If you go back in history a little bit, defibrillators are obviously about using electricity to help save lives. When do you think the first recorded instance in history was of electricity trying to revive a dead body? And any ideas, just guesses? Well, obviously this isn't interactive, so what we'll do is we'll go through and I'll just give you a clue. It was 2400 BC. Now, obviously, they didn't have defibrillators as we knew them, but the ancient Egyptians and in the hieroglyphics recorded around the pyramids and elsewhere throughout Egypt did talk about the finger of the gods, the lightning coming from the gods and from Ra, and that's why they always put metal caps on the top of pyramids and on tops of obelisks to try and attract the electricity to come down on the basis that it may actually revive the dead body. Wasn't that successful because the Egyptians had a habit of chewing out people's brains and cutting out their hearts and other organs and sticking them in alabaster jars. But nonetheless, the idea was there. But it is a good talking point for next time you're having a pub quiz. So let's tell you a bit about us. So as we said, we're a charity. We've done about 8,500 projects to date, and we're actually increasing that number by about 500 per year at the current rate. Some of those are directly working with communities, some of those work through third parties. So within the UK, there's a very nice, very exciting sport called cricket, and we work with the organisers of cricket to try and place those. For example, we've also worked with rugby, with tennis, with bowls, with croquet. Very English, these sports, but the idea is to get as many of these out into communities as we can do. And our our objective as an organization is very simple. It's all about easy access defibrillation. We refer to that as easy public access defibrillation, or EPADS. That doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be out on the street in the community. It could be in a foyer of a hotel, it could be in a foyer of an office block, but they're out there where members of the public can gain access to them in a very easy way. These projects should be sustainable and long-term projects. So we have a little saying internally that the defibrillator should be as good in year 10 as it is in year 1. We make sure that it's part of a resilience program. So it's not just about putting the defibrillator out there, but it's also encouraging communities to do things like first aid projects and care of the elderly projects and so on and so forth. We work with communities, but we also work with individuals. And we do have a program where we do support families whose children have been diagnosed with heart conditions, where they're looking for a defibrillator, maybe just for a short term, maybe for a couple of years, and we'll actually help them out and loan them equipment. Defibrillators we put out there have been deployed to about 4,000 heart attacks and cardiac arrests so far. So it seems to be doing it. The survival rate in the UK is around 25%. So hopefully we're doing some good out there. So in summary, we want increase in bystander help. We want people to do something rather than doing nothing. Don't just stand back and say, oh, look, they're lying on the ground. They don't look very well. But get in there and do something. We want them to do chest compressions. We want them to get hold of the emergency services very quickly. We want them to get the nearest defibrillator and start using those defibrillators as quickly as they can do. And part of what we do is making sure that there is community training programs going on within the environments of wherever that defibrillator is. And those community training programs could be about just basic life support. There could be more enhanced first aid. And to date, we've done something in the region of 250,000 people have been through the courses that we've put on. Those are face-to-face courses. They're not online. They're not videos. They're not downloading something off YouTube. These are face-to-face courses. The figure's probably higher than that, but we gave up counting at 250,000. So we've got some firsts that we're quite pleased about and we like to share. We were the very first organisation to go to British Telecom and suggest that telephone kiosks were used as defibrillator locations. So these nice big red icons that are typically British, they tend to be right in the centre of communities. And we thought, what a great idea. If the defibrillator is going to be in the centre of the community and these phone boxes are being closed down because nobody ever used them, they've all got mobile phones, maybe we could take some of those over. And so we started to do that. We've done about 1,000 so far, where we've converted for defibrillator locations, and other people have taken on that idea as well. But what we did do with that is set the standards. A lot of these are very old. They need to be renovated before you can actually use them. And a lot of them didn't have things like electrical safety standards. So we had to address things like that. After all, we wouldn't want somebody getting an unintentional shock. We were the very first organisation to use governance and put in place a governance system for the management of defibrillators in the community. That's been in place since 2010. And again, as we stand here today in 2023, it's still being used. It's in its second iteration at the moment. We're about to launch its third iteration, which will have even more information in there on how to manage a defibrillator. We're the very first people to go out and say, shouldn't we have standardized colors for defibrillators, and shouldn't those be high visibility and easy to spot? After all, getting a defibrillator is about time. Let's make it as easy as possible for people to actually find the locations. We also put with those defibrillator cabinets the chain of survival, whether it be on a poster, whether it be on the cabinets, just to make sure people understand that what they're doing is part of a chain. It's not just a single entity. We also worked with ambulance service to have standardized lock codes. So whilst in an ideal world you would never have a lock cabinet, in the UK there's an awful lot of lock cabinets. We've just completed a little bit of work with another charity in the UK, and we've identified that somewhere between 15 and 30% of cabinets that defibrillators are in the UK all have locks on. So what we did is we worked with ambulance services to try and get a standardized mechanism for having lock codes, so that if somebody forgets the code, the ambulance service can pretty much guess what it's going to be. We very much use the ILCOR AED signage, and we try to encourage people to have this standardized international signage. You don't know where somebody's come from. You don't know if somebody's going away on holiday. So why shouldn't you have international signage and make the job easier for people? We also tend to promote defibrillators with visual displays. And the reason for that's very simple. In a public domain, you have no idea who's going to be using this equipment. And if they don't speak English, or they're very stressed out and focused and zoned in, or they can't read, or they have visual handicaps, or whatever it happens to be, then defibrillators with visual displays actually make the job easier. And that's really how we got involved with defib tech, because of their Lifeline View defibrillator, which is now probably the leading machine we put out into communities. And we were actually the very first organization to say to communities, here is the complete support package. So all you need to worry about is concentrating, getting that defibrillator in there, making sure people are aware. We'll take care of everything else for you. So that's briefly about us. Now, what I'd like to do is just play you, one of our clients is called the Cooperative Society within the UK, and we've worked a lot with them to put defibrillators in. What I'd like to do is really just play for the next 90 seconds, a little video that they put out to their shareholders.
The Mid-Counties Cooperative have supported the Community Heartbeat Trust now for many years. In that time, we've encouraged many of our local communities to adopt a defibrillator, and that's been produced by lots of fundraising, lots of education, and raising awareness to the vital part that defibrillators play in our community infrastructure.
We've been working with Mid-Counties Cooperative now for 6 or 7 years, and during that time we've placed many defibrillators outside their shops. As part of that, we've also trained their staff and trained their members of the community, and we also support those defibrillators to make sure they're always rescue ready.
The defibrillator is very important in Brood, as it is with any rural community. There's a lot of elderly people, a lot of them don't have families around here, the doctors is set out of the village, it's a long way from the hospitals or the nearest ambulance stations, in bad weather particularly, traffic can't get into the village, so it's a matter of life and death for a lot of our customers and the villagers.
The store is definitely in the heart of the community. The defibrillator was used on a customer. It was outside the shop, and she had just collapsed. Kelly, one of our colleagues, went out to her and took the defibrillator. They administered first aid until the ambulance service arrived.
As a charity, we're immensely grateful for the support of Mid-Counties Cooperative. We couldn't have done this sort of project without your support. Together, in partnership, we put defibrillators out there that are saving lives. So a little bit of self-promotion there, but I think it really captured what it's about. It's working in partnership with some of these organizations like retail food chains, for example, to try and get as many of those machines out into the public domain as we can do. So let's think about what is cardiac arrest in the UK. So if you go back to the year 2000, the survival rate in the UK from out of hospital cardiac arrest was around 2%. Not very good. 98% of people were dying. Last year, by the end of 2022, that figure was up at around the 25% survival to hospital, so the development of return of spontaneous circulation. And it is a factor of time. So a lot of that is about making sure these machines are actually in the center of communities, that they can be found very quickly. They're actually positioned at locations that if a complete stranger was told to go and fetch one, that complete stranger could find that location very easily. What happens in the UK is if you look at rural communities compared to city communities, the survival from cardiac arrest is about 30% less than cities. That's horrendous if you think about it. But again, rural communities by definition are very spread out, and therefore it's a factor of time. The other thing that's really hitting the topic at the moment in the UK is social deprivation. And what's come up from the studies that have been published recently is that something like areas of social deprivation, whether they be inner cities, whether they be rural, the survival from out-hospital cardiac arrest is only about 50%. So it is actually a real major issue, and that's really what we're here to try and solve if we're able to do so. A reminder that cardiac arrest is not a heart attack, but a heart attack can obviously lead to cardiac arrest. And this is one of the big educational things that we need to get across to communities. Heart attack is about plumbing, cardiac arrest is about electrical problems. We often relate it to central heating, for example. So the heart attack is a blockage in your pipe or your pump, powering the central heating, but the cardiac arrest is where somebody's, the fuse has gone or somebody switched off the power. So Cardiac arrest, a lot of people don't realize that cardiac arrest actually has a lot of causes. We think about 92. Most people think about it in terms of heart attack, but there's also choking, electrocution, asthma, anaphylaxis, severe fluid loss, arrhythmias, all sorts of things. And this sort of education actually is a revelation to a lot of people that it's not just a heart attack, it is actually lots of other things can actually cause it. And when you actually talk to people that maybe things like choking are very, very high potential cause of cardiac arrest, and you think, how many restaurants are out there? Have they got defibrillators in restaurants? Has your local McDonald's got a defibrillator, for example? And the answer generally is no. Shopping centres now, luckily, shopping centres now have had a big campaign to get defibrillators out there, but there are many, many uses, and we can use those causes of cardiac arrest to try and help people identify where best to actually place these. Now, the other thing which we try to get across to people is that in cardiac arrest, the body is dying by about 20% per minute. We do not use the 10% figure per minute. There's a variety of reasons we don't do that, but the clinical evidence that we actually use says that it's actually about 23% per minute. And to try and sort of save that life, what you have to do is get in there and do those chest compressions. The chest compressions will move that curve to the right, as you see it, and give you time to actually do something else. But it does emphasize to people, if it is 20% per minute, this is a factor of time. One has to actually get in there. But the other really interesting information that's come across from studies in Europe is that it's also related to distance. So survivability decreases by about 50% for every 100 meters or 100 yards, if you want to use American terminology. For every 100 meters away from where a defibrillator is, then the survivability drops by about 50%. So again, we can actually use that. And one of the things we do within communities is look at a map of the community and actually position them so that ideally they're placed at about 200-meter intervals, if we can do. So we're actually trying to look at all the various different aspects to try and decrease this death by cardiac arrest. A couple of weeks ago, there was a very interesting paper published by the Scottish Government, which actually looks at the current state of cardiac arrest and defibrillation within the Scottish area. And what they came up with was something very powerful. And that is, if you look at the various different social categories, so here they call them SIMD1, SIMD2, ... to SIMD3. SIMD1 is the most deprived people within the community. SIMD5 are the richest people within the community. And if you look at that, the blue column is the amount of cardiac arrest. The black column is the amount of defibrillators within a 200-meter radius of where that cardiac arrest occurred. And if you look at it, the amount of defibrillators that are in areas of social deprivation compared to amount of defibrillators in areas of wealth, there's a big discrepancy there. And that's one of the things that the UK government is beginning to look at and say, maybe we should just take a step back here and plan what we do in a little bit more. We've been doing this for 10 years, but at least now, centrally within the UK, they're beginning to look at this in a very constructive way. So it is about this thing called the chain of survival and the 5 stages of the chain of survival. People can influence stages 1 to 4, that is check the patient, identify and easily recognize that his cardiac arrest, call for the emergency services, in this country 999, in other countries 911, 112, etc. Commence chest compressions and making sure that they're underway as quickly as possible. And if somebody is suspected of cardiac arrest in the UK, phoning for an ambulance, the ambulance operators are now charged legally with getting you doing those chest compressions within 60 seconds of your phone call, such as the importance of doing that. And they're getting the defibrillator on them as quickly as possible. And that's why we put them in very easy to find locations. We can't affect stage 5 in the community at all. What we can do is affect stages 1 to 4. And in those stages 1 to 4, if we could do 1 to 4 in 3 minutes, we're looking around a half to 3/4 of people surviving. If it takes 10 minutes to do stages 1 to 4, you're looking at about 5%. So that really gets the urgency over to people that it's really important that they actually do something. But those 3 first stages are also about education. And so a lot of what we try to do is encourage education. You often see people saying, you don't need to be trained to use a defibrillator. Well, technically that's right, but that's only stage 4. What about stages 1, 2, and 3? Education is key. Education is really important as far as we're concerned. Now, the other thing which we do as a charity is we look at the equipment that's on the market, and we actually ask of it questions as to whether that machine is really suitable for use in a community setting. Community for us is an untrained user in a very panicky situation because their loved one's on the ground under a lot of stress. Could they actually use the defibrillator very easily? And it's one of the questions. In fact, we actually ask 53 different questions of every piece of equipment we test. And in very simple terms, anything above 47, which is the top third of the scoring, we think is good. Anything below about the figure of 27, we probably wouldn't advise them to use that equipment, or we haven't tested it. The middle bit between the 27 and 47, we think are great machines for using if there's a trained user, but probably not the sort of thing we as a charity would put out there. So you can see there the highest scoring ones. The View is obviously a key one within there. But we also do that for storage as well. So we look at the cabinets. So recently we did a bit of work looking at over 4,000 cabinets that contain defibrillators to say, what are the best types and what's the different types of construction, what impact do they have, what types of heaters do they have in them, what sort of cabinets actually result in problems for us. Will those actually result in support? That support has to be paid for somehow. So we naturally orientate to cabinets, for example, that don't cause a lot of support for us. There's a big debate in the UK as to whether cabinets should be locked or unlocked because of this fear of thefts and vandalism. And again, work that we've done with the British Heart Foundation, and we've actually done analysis of 60,000 defibrillator sites over the past 2 years, and we've looked at theft and vandalism, and it's currently running to about 0.4%, which is not very high. So if you look at locked versus unlocked, it's exactly the same. It doesn't matter whether it's locked or unlocked, the levels of vandalism and theft are exactly the same. Now, one of the other things which we do as an organization is to try and help people keep accurate records on their equipment to make sure that equipment is kept in a rescue-ready condition. So we produce this online system, online defibrillator governance system, which we call WebNOS. WebNOS simply stands for Web-Based Notification System. It's a working title and it's sort of stick. So this has actually been running since 2010 and allows us to look at all sorts of different information on the defibrillator and present that information to the end users. So, for example, it will summarize whatever current information. It'll tell them whether they've got support in place, when the next check is actually due, and it will remind them through emails, etc. It will actually keep a record of all the activity, all the resupply records, all the usage records, every time it's been deployed, that sort of information. And one of the key things we do as a charity too is offer counselling. So if somebody's pretty freaked out by the fact they've taken part in a rescue, we offer them free counselling services. As a charity, so that is also recorded through the system. So that governance system is in wide usage. It also allows us to publish some of the data, so you can actually go online and see maps of where the defibrillators are, and it will tell you whether that defibrillator is active or not active. And if you click on the little button there where it says "See Details," if you click on that, it will actually tell you from your location where the nearest defibrillator is, and actually plot out for you on Google Maps, the route that you should be taking either by car or by foot. But this accurate record keeping isn't just about, is it in service, out of service? It's all about issues that may be resulting from that, any investigations that may have happened as to why didn't it work or why did it work in a certain way. We keep all the training records on there. We keep all the historical records about who's been checking it, how often they've been checking it. Those records are transferable. People don't necessarily stay where they are. Equipment doesn't stay as it is when it's put in. It may get updated, it may get taken out because of loan equipment going in there, it may be faulty and be replaced, so the records are all transferable, but we keep all the historical data on the old machine as well. As I said, it links to mapping services, but it also keeps things like out of service records, and if being out of service is then being checked, so if it's been sent back to DFibTech, for example, for assessment or whatever it happens to be, all of those service records are there. But we also keep within that system storage information about the location, about what type of location. Is it a village hall? Is it a telephone box? If it's a telephone box, what type of telephone box is it? Is it connected to electricity? Who's the electricity supplier? Has there been any problems with electrical supply, etc., etc., etc.? So there's a whole lot of information that goes within record keeping, not just about ticking a box saying it's in action and not in action. So for us, governance is about a whole host of things. We always insist on the training for reasons that we talked about. The phraseology, you shouldn't need to be trained to use a defibrillator, isn't actually correct from what the guidance is in the UK. The guidance says those untrained should not be prevented from using a defibrillator. So slightly different, but we always insist on training with any defibrillator that goes in. Accurate record keeping. But also it's about insurances. It's also about public liability. If you're putting something out in the public domain in the UK, you have public liability issues. So when you put something out there in a cabinet for a member of the public to use, is there a health and safety issue there? Can people get to that cabinet safely? They're not going to trip over, a tripwire or a hole in the ground or something like that and result in another injury. Is it at the right height off the ground, that cabinet? Now, there is actually a requirement in the UK that if you're putting something in a public domain, obviously it has to be accessible to people in wheelchairs. So if your defibrillator being put out there, don't put it 6 foot off the ground, but actually put it, the guidance is 1.1 meters, that's windowsill height to the bottom of the cabinet it's stored in, and 1.3 meters to the handle of the cabinet if you're going to open it. So again, it's making sure people actually meet those requirements for health and safety legislation. But we also make sure that it meets what's called equality legislation. If somebody is hard of hearing, if somebody has a visual impairment, if somebody doesn't speak English as a first language, how do you make sure that the equipment is available for use by them without impediment? So there's a lot that goes into it, and that's what we're really about. We're there to try and help. We also make sure communities have support plans in place. It's not just about pads and batteries when expired, but it's about lots of hidden costs. And when you look at the hidden costs, those hidden costs include things like replacement rescue kit. We put in with our defibrillators things like safety items, PPE, and so on and so forth. How do you replace those? If your defibrillator does go missing, do you need to rent one or borrow one? So again, we capture that and we provide that. If you need to get it out to a location, it needs to be taken by courier. So within the support agreements, we pay for the cost of the courier, and so on and so forth as you go down through the list. There's actually a lot of things in there when it comes to support. And what we try to do with support agreements is to say to people, look, you need to budget for all of those, but if you have support agreements, those are all included. But if you're not having a support agreement and you're just paying as you go, then please do make sure you budget for those going along. Again, we help a community with a project plan. So it's not about, let's buy a defibrillator, put it in there, tick the box and move on. That's not what we do. If you want to do that, go to an internet provider. If you're working with us, we'll sit with the community, we'll look at the needs assessment, we'll look at how they're actually going to fund it. Is it collections? Is it charitable funding? Is there grant funding available? Can you get sponsorship from commercial organizations? Choosing the right equipment for that community. So for example, if you're on a seaside where there's salt spray and everything else, it may be different equipment than if you're inland, somebody in a housing estate in the middle of the country. We'll supply the equipment. We'll also offer installation. We don't say we have to install. We'll offer the community our installers if they wish to take advantage of that. And probably about 50% of people do. We've talked about the training. We talked about long-term support, which we think are important. But that long-term support is also helping them to encourage them to do other things in the community, like first aid programs, care of the elderly programs, neighborhood watch programs, and so on. And we can actually bring those into the package and help them. We offer post-rescue counselling, which we talked about, and to date we are still the only people that actually offer that as a routine part of the service, and of course governance. But our projects, or the projects we put in, should be as good in year 10 as it is in year 1, and that's our modus operandi. So we're here to work with communities to try and help them save lives. It's not our job as a charity to try and persuade them to have a defibrillator. They have to make that decision for themselves, but we'll certainly help them go through that decision process. But if they do choose to have one, what we will do is make sure that project is done to best practice and is good for the community, for the next 10 years. There's a very simple phrase we use a lot. A defibrillator is not just for Christmas, it's actually for life. And that's a phrase we use a lot. So it's not about just Christmas, unwrap it, there we are, got it, put it away on the shelf, never look at it again. These are for life in all senses of the word. A defibrillator is for life, and that's really what we're trying to help people do. So with that, my brief was to talk for about 30 minutes, and I'm 2 minutes short of that, so I hope I haven't underrun there, Mike. I hope that's okay with you. Perfect. So if I stop sharing, and I think I saw some questions pop up on the screen as we were chatting.
Yeah. Definitely. One question that popped up is just about the video. So just so everybody knows, again, we are recording this, and it will be on our YouTube channel. We're going to share it with Martin and his team. So if you missed the video portion for whatever reason, or you want to go back and check any of the slides, you certainly will have access to do that. But one of the questions that that came up, so if somebody, a community wants to work with you, they reach out, they reach out to Community Heartbeat Trust, and you kind of touched on it a little bit. So how long is that whole process? Is the first thing you do, you just kind of set up a meeting with them, determine, what they need, and then, an estimate of how long does it take for them to kind of now, get the AEDs and kind of be set up in your system?
Right. Okay. Well, the short answer to that is how long is a piece of string? It can vary. It could be that they've already gone through that process and they're only contacting us as the last point in the chain and want us to help them fulfill. So they've gone through all that assessment and pre-planning, or they might want us to actually do that whole thing, including helping them fundraise and everything else. I think the shortest project I'd done was probably about 2 days. And I went and did the presentation to the community. They asked me to come and do the presentation. That was on the Thursday. I went down on the Friday evening and did a presentation to the village. They decided that evening to send out a little letter to all the houses. There weren't that many. It was only 250 houses in the village. They sent a letter out saying this is what they want to do. By Monday lunch time, they had all the funds raised, and we actually delivered it on the Tuesday.
Wow.
So that was a pretty fast one. But on the other side of the coin, I was talking to somebody this morning. We started the project in 2018 with them, and they still haven't taken delivery. Now, okay, part of that was COVID, which threw things up in the air a little bit. But the point is that, people come in very enthusiastic, then somebody else joins, has different questions, and then that group goes because they've moved out of the community. Then it sort of sits for a while, and then somebody will pick it up and run with it again. So, that's a long-term project. Typically, though, a project is usually from initial discussions to delivery and training always being the last point before, the last point of the implementation. Typically is probably about 2 to 3 months.
Gotcha. Cool. Another question that just came through. This is actually a really interesting one, and it came from one of our great partners here in the U.S. that's doing a lot of great work in the Philadelphia area called Simon's Heart. And we talk about this a lot, but can you just kind of talk through the locked versus unlocked cabinets? Because I think in the U.S. we we're talking about placing them outdoors, and a lot of people, the first thing that always is asked is like, what about theft? So if you could just kind of talk through your thoughts on, I know you had a slide and some stats on the locked versus unlocked, but just kind of your thoughts on that and what your recommendations would be.
Okay. In an ideal world, you always put it unlocked. But we don't live in an ideal world. Now, I can talk about UK experience, and you'll have to sort of interpret that into US and elsewhere. But if you look at the UK compared to the rest of the countries in Europe, there's a very interesting difference in views. So if you go onto the continental Europe, so France, Germany, Holland, Denmark, wherever, you rarely see a locked cabinet. But if you come to the UK, something like 80% of the cabinets are locked. So, one can ask immediately, is it a social thing? Is it a thought process thing? Is it just the Brits are suspicious about people, stealing things? And I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that depending on whether you look at our statistics or BHF's, although BHF are redoing theirs because we suggested to them they'd actually miscounted. But something like 15 to 30% of cabinets in the UK are unlocked, which means that somewhere between 70 to 80% are locked in the UK. And it's this fear of theft and vandalism. It's this fear that if you put it out into a community, some chap is going to come along and going to grab it and walk off with it, or play football with it, or throw it in the river, or whatever it happens to be. That happens very rarely. Generally it's interesting. So work that we've done, we do a lot of work obviously with schools, but when we look at where the vandalism and thefts occur, it's usually the 30 to 40 age group. It's not the teenagers. It's not the more elderly end of the spectrum. It tends to be that very narrow band in the middle. Kids know about defibrillators. They're seeing their sports heroes collapse on football pitches or whatever and be resuscitated. They have them in schools. They have education in schools. They respect them. And similarly, at the other end of the spectrum, people, the higher end of the spectrum, they have more heart attacks, and so they respect them. It's that middle group. But even so, that middle group, it's only about 0.4%, less than 0.5% are actually either vandalized or stolen. The bigger issue is actually how many are actually taken to rescue and not returned, which is a much higher percentage. Now, we can, through help with the ambulance services, trace most of those, but it does take time. And some of the tracing is really quite bizarre. So those of you know geography in the UK, if you know, Newcastle is right up in the northeast of the country, Southampton's on the south coast. We had one disappear from Newcastle a short while ago, and we found it in a hospital. In an ED department in a hospital in Southampton. How does it go the 500 miles between the two? And it was logical when you thought about it, because the patient was picked up, taken to the hospital in Newcastle with the defibrillator, the community defibrillator. They were then shipped by air ambulance down to a specialist unit in Southampton, but of course the defibrillator went with them. Now, it took us 3 or 4 weeks to find it, but we eventually found it and returned. But during that period, and that's why I said in the support, you have loan machines and you have rental machines, it's a hidden cost. During that period, we try to make sure that the location is not without a machine. So the short answer to locked versus unlocked, our philosophy is very simple. We prefer people to have unlocked, but they know their community better than we do. So it's not our job to tell them what they should have, but we give them a choice of locked or unlocked. They will then do their own risk assessment and then make a decision whether it should be locked or unlocked. However, if it is locked, we have some rules. And those rules are that if somebody's using it in an emergency, whatever that code needs to be has to be memorable. Because if you're given the code and said there's a defibrillator down the road, when you get to wherever it is, you've got to remember what that code is. Now, I don't know about people listening to this, but remembering PIN numbers on credit cards, you always have problems. I mean, for me, I stick them all on my mobile phone because I can never remember them. But the point is, beyond 4 digits, people can't remember them. And you put them under stress, and you have this thing called stress dyslexia. They start mixing up the numbers. So the rules for us is that a code is never more than 4 digits. It should be incredibly easy to use. And it also should take into account, the lock should take into account the fact you may have stress dyslexia. So you should be able to put those numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 in any order, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1, 3, 2, 4, and the cabinet will still open. So there are some basic rules that if a cabinet is locked, then there is good practice as to what you can follow in terms of a lock. The other thing about lock cabinets is locks do jam. And the last thing you want is a lock to jam in a rescue. So don't go cheap. Buy the most expensive lock you can find to go on that cabinet, and preferably one that's marine grade. So if it does get wet, if it does get salt in it, it doesn't rust and jam. But you still need to maintain that. It's part of your maintenance regimen of your public access defibrillator is putting things like WD-40 on the locks to make sure they still work.
Oh, great points. I think a lot of times we talk about this, they don't take into account the human stress that comes with one of these situations. Yep. Most lay rescuers, and some maybe not, but this is one of the most stressful moments of their life when they're responding to one of these situations.
And the other thing very quickly about that is what we do is we don't necessarily choose the numbers. What we choose is a pattern. So if somebody who's got visual impairment, or it's dark, or whatever it happens to be, or their light on their phone's not working, they can still find the pattern. It might be a Z pattern, it might be top 4 numbers, it may be all the numbers coming down one side, whatever it happens to be. So we actually use patterns as opposed to think about the numbers.
Interesting. So I think we have time for 1 or 2 more. So one that just came through: is it safe to use the adult pads on a pediatric patient in case pediatric pads are not available?
Short answer is yes. I mean, in the UK, the ambulance services just say forget pediatrics. Pediatric cardiac arrest in the UK, pediatric being defined as 7 and under, pediatric cardiac arrest in the UK is so incredibly rare. There's about 10 cases a year out of 50 million, 60 million people. So it's not huge. So what tends to happen is if you had defibrillator switches or defibrillators with the pediatric pads there in a public access setting, you don't know if that person's accessing it is aware of what is meant by pediatric. So they may actually have a 10 or 11-year-old who's collapsed because they've been hit in the chest with a ball. Are they a child or are they an adult? Well, actually, in defibrillator terms, they're an adult, not a child. But in a human nature response, they're a child. So would you use pediatric pads? The answer is no, you wouldn't. But a member of the public may not know that. So it just creates confusion. Success in this marketplace is keeping it simple. The rescuer is probably untrained. They're going to be panicking, stressful. Make it simple for them. Don't put complexity in there. So we don't put any pediatric pads in there. We don't use machines with pediatric switches because that just causes problems.
Again, kind of goes back to what we were saying before. We want to make this as simple as possible for the lay rescuer.
Simple as possible.
This question came through, and I don't know if we're going to be able to answer it fully, but it was: do old and expired pads still work okay? I can answer it from like a manufacturer side. I don't know if you have anything you wanna say about it.
We simply refer people to the manufacturers.
Yeah. I mean, the pads have an expiration date for a reason. And that reason is that the pads are, gonna work and do the best possible job up until the expiration date. So that's why it's there, and that's why, systems like Martin uses are important to ensure that you're never in a situation where you go to use an AED on a person with expired pads. With that being said, I would never delay care. I would never, not put, if my only option was to take a set of pads and use them, and I would use them. But the expiration date is there for a reason. You want to make sure you're never in a situation where you're going to have to use expired pads.
I think the other thing with modern machines, modern defibrillators, is that they have little chips, timing chips in the pads, so that the machine itself knows when the pads are expired. And most machines on the market, with a Defib Tech or Zoll or whoever it happens to be, those machines will start very irritatingly start beeping and flashing lights at you. And that's using the battery up. So if you do go beyond your expiry date on your pads, you are actually having a little bit of a double whammy in that the battery is now being degraded much faster as well. So I would always encourage people to look for the expiry date and change them on or within 7 days of that expiry date.
Definitely. So last question here, and this is from me, because I went to, like I said, visit Martin and the organization back in June. And, I have an organization here in the US and Connecticut. And, I totally aspire to be able to kind of make sure we're setting up organizations like Martin and his team do. But I'm just kind of curious, what you guys have done an incredible amount in the short time that, you've had the organization. Just talk about the future. I don't know. Do you have any future goals, or what the next couple of years, what you hope to see? If there's a number of AEDs you hope to have placed, is there any sort of future goals that you have for the organization?
I think I need a holiday. Okay, we constantly look at equipment. There's some very creative equipment coming along, which you'll be familiar with from a variety of different manufacturers. We also input, including to your own organizations, our thoughts about how we would like to see this equipment develop into the future. We're probably going to do a lot more in terms of education, and also the home market. That's an area where people are beginning to ask. It's people have seen them out in the community, and people are beginning to say to us, "Could we have these at home?" They're probably in the wrong price bracket at the moment to go into home markets, but for people who perhaps have a heart complaint or something like that, then there is a potential for that in that market. But I think it's really looking at what is best. I always equate defibrillators with mobile phones in some respects. So that's a Samsung 9, so it's about a 2018 model. But if you look at the more modern ones now, and your Samsung, whatever they are, and flip phones and all the rest of it, and then you go back and you look in 2010, oh, you had your very first iPhones. And if you go back to the year 2000, guess what? The really coolest thing was this little Nokia with a screen, and you could do text messages. Wow, as well as making phone calls. So, I say to people, I've got a great camera, and it also makes phone calls. But the point is, the technology is changing all the time. And I think defibrillators are a little way behind the move in technology. And I think, as we move forward, I think you see some of the newer things that are being made possible by technology coming through. And that's really quite exciting.
Definitely. Cool. Well, Martin, thank you so much for taking the time to do this with us today. And, like I said in the beginning, one of the big things we talk about at the FibTech is, getting the AED is a great step, but it's not the end step. It's just the beginning, and making sure that, you have plans in place to always have it be ready to use, and make sure people are ready to use it is equally as important. And I think you guys have really set the standard for that. So thank you for all the great work that you do.
Thank you. And thank you very much for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you everybody for listening. Like we said, this webinar is being recorded. We will have it up on our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to rewatch it or send it to anybody who might be interested. Thank you all for listening, and have a great day.